Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to take a look at the Empire Ears Odin. Now this is one of the most expensive IEMs that I've ever come across. It comes in right at around $3,400. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is not something where we're talking about value. The Odin is the latest and greatest in the ultra high-end, crazy expensive flagship IEM world. Let's take a look. And just like with my other reviews, you'll be able to find the written review along with measurements and frequency response and all the rest of that stuff up on headphones.com. I'll leave a link to that in the description, as well as to a community forum thread where you guys can chime in as well. For this review, we're going to talk about the build, design, and comfort. We'll talk about technical performance like detail retrieval, speed, dynamic, soundstage, imaging, and timbre. We're going to go over the frequency response and tonal balance, give a couple comparisons, and then ultimately decide whether or not it's worth it. And to begin with, let's talk about the build, design, and comfort. The Odin is probably the flashiest looking IEM that I've ever come across. This is almost too intense for my liking. I tend to prefer the sort of understated type of thing. Remembering, of course, that, you're generally walking outside in public with IEMs, but it does look fantastic if you're into this kind of aesthetic. For the shell, this is sort of the usual acrylic design from Empire Ears, and I actually really like this because it feels durable. I find that Empire Ears IEMs are generally quite comfortable in spite of the fact that they're a little bit on the larger side, especially if you get, the tips with the right size for your ears. They have a very comfortable fit actually, and you don't have any jagged edges on the outside of the IEM, on the outside of the housing, so that's really nice. The cable here is also fantastic. It's very tangle free, easy to use, and it's lightweight. And then, of course, you have this little, again, it's just more bling in the cable connector. For me, it's too much. Like, I know this is the flagship and the most expensive IEM and everything, and I guess it should be, eye-catching for that price, because you're not just buying an IEM at this price. This has got to be something a little more than that. And it is, definitely. So if this is the kind of aesthetic and look that you're into, that's great. This cable in particular is terminated in 2.5 millimeter balanced, but you could use an adapter or I believe other 2-pin cables with this. But this I find works just fine. I've been running it mostly off of a DAP with an adapter. I've been using the Ibasso DX160 and the DX220, and both of them work just fine. One other thing to note before we talk about the sound, and this is something that I want to add to my IEM reviews in general, and it's usability when walking outside. And the reason why I think this is important is because for some IEMs, depending on the fit and the seal and everything, with certain tips, it can introduce a kind of muffling effect when you're walking and you hear your footsteps because of the vibrations that are going all the way up through your body into your ears. These vibrations can come through as kind of like a low frequency thump, and that can intrude on some of the music that you're listening to. And so my question when using IEMs for anybody who is buying IEM specifically to go walk somewhere, go walk outside, is, does it have this effect? This can be lessened a little bit with foam tips, and so when you use foam tips, because they're porous, they don't have this problem. And then when you use tips like the silicone tips, like the ones from Final Audio, there tends to be a little bit more of an issue because it creates a seal. I've even had times when cables are microphonic. And so basically, the question of usability while walking is something that I want to start including. And for the Empire Ears Odin, it was totally fine. I went for a walk in the woods. I almost got lost, but the IEMs were able to keep me company. I didn't have any issues with usability, so that was great, apart from getting lost. I almost got eaten by a bear. That didn't happen. Now, let's talk about how this sounds. And for technical performance, I got to start with what is all going on in here and the driver configuration. So the Empire Ears Odin uses 11 drivers. 2 of them are dynamic drivers in the bass. They call them their Weapon 9 Plus subwoofers. So these are, I guess, new ones, I'm assuming, because the Legend X also used 2 Weapon 9 subwoofers. And then there are 5 balanced armature drivers in the mids, and upper mids as well. And then you also have 4 electrostatic drivers, well, they call them electrostatic, but they're a kind of electrostatic that often goes into IEMs. It's not the same as like over-ear electrostatic headphones, but they call them electrostatic drivers, and they are for the treble and like upper treble frequencies and like super high frequencies. The use of these 3 driver types isn't something new, but this has certainly got a lot of drivers in there. I'm actually not sure if there's anything else that has this many drivers in that sort of quote-unquote tribrid design. So for detail retrieval, the Empire Ears Odin is one of, if not the best that I've ever heard. And I want to kind of lead this off by saying that the whole presentation for everything with the Empire Ears Odin could be described as smooth. I mean, it has a kind of smoothness for the entirety of the frequency response, for everything, all of the instruments that I hear, all the music that I listen to with this was smooth. It came across as smooth. And the cool thing about this is that it was able to be both smooth and extremely detailed at the same time. And for reference, my favorite IEM so far has been the 64 Audio U12T. Now, I'll do a comparison with that one, but as far as detail goes, for the bass and mids, I'd actually give the edge to the Empire Ears Odin, while for the treble detail, I'd give the edge to the 64 Audio U12T. But with that said, for image clarity and the transparency of the window that you're looking through, peering into the music through, the Empire Ears Odin is on another level from everything else that I've heard so far. And one of the cool things that I noticed about this was that I could throw anything at this and it would still be extremely detailed and clear and clean sounding. So, I threw heavy metal at this, expecting things to kind of blend together a little bit, and it really didn't. Like, this managed to handle it really, really well. So that was truly impressive. And actually, I've got a review of another IEM that was also able to do that, where it didn't matter what I threw at it, but you guys will just have to stay tuned for that one. For speed and dynamics, throughout the mids, it's quite quick, and the leading edge is very immediate, very snappy, similar to many other high-end multi-balanced armature configurations. The treble here, this is going to sound a little weird, but the treble here reminds me almost a little bit of that smooth quality that you get from the HT650. Now, it's not the same as the HT650, it's a totally different thing, but there's a smoothness to that one that it's reminiscent of in the Odin. When it comes to dynamics, the Odin is fantastic. The dynamic drivers in the bass there with the W9 subwoofers or W9 plus subwoofers, you get a ton of punch and impact in spite of the fact that the frequency response isn't particularly elevated in that range like it is on the Legend X. It's elevated a little bit, but not like to bass head levels. This is much more tastefully done tuning for this, and we'll get to that. But for the dynamics here, yeah, it's quite punchy and impactful, at least for the bass. For soundstage and imaging, this is one of the coolest presentations. This is a very all-encompassing and enveloping kind of sound, similar to that of the Legend X. So it's not like you're sitting at a distance in front of a stage, because the center image isn't that thrown forward. And the lateral definition, while not the widest that I've ever heard, is also decent. And this is really cool because it doesn't try and fake any of the soundstage stuff through weird frequency response tunings and things like that, like some other IEMs do, like for example the Campfire Aura or Era does it, and this does not. So you get a decent soundstage, decent, not the largest, but decent, without any of the trickery that sometimes is required for that. And then for the imaging, yeah, the image placement and separation and precision is fantastic. It's some of the best that I've heard. It reminds me a little bit of the Focal Utopia in that regard for over-ear headphones, where the image placement is very, very surgical and precise. And this, I think, also lends itself to some of the detail retrieval, especially in those lower frequencies, and being able to kind of hold everything together, even in complex, busy passages. For timbre, this is something where I often worry about balanced armature timbre, and because, well, less than half of the drivers are BAs here, it's not really that noticeable on it. I do think that it is a little bit noticeable for those mid-frequencies, but not in any super negative way, not like the Zeus 14, for example, which was really bad for that. And as far as frequency response related timbre goes, this isn't particularly shifted or anything like that either. It elevates at a fairly normal spot for the ear-related gain factors, which we will talk about next. So for this, if you guys want to check out the measurements of this IEM that were done, I'll leave a link to that in the description. It'll be posted in the community forum thread there, and then also in the full written review as well. Just know that this is not the same coupler that many other reviewers are using that have, the resonance there up at around like 8K hertz. This tries to dampen the resonance a little bit, but there's also a fairly good argument that suggests that it goes too far for the sake of readability in the treble. So I think with this coupler, you could expect a little bit more treble than what it shows here, around 8K hertz. And then with those other older RA0045 couplers, you could expect a little bit less treble than what the coupler resonance shows at around 8K hertz. And I think this is just sort of something that we need to pay attention to when we're evaluating IEM measurements in particular. But in any case, let's talk about the bass response. And for the bass, this is right where I want it to be. I mean, the bass level here is perfect. Keeping in mind, of course, that this is a dynamic driver configuration, well, two dynamic drivers in particular. So you do get really good excursive slam. You get really good punch there, in spite of the fact that the bass isn't that elevated. So I think it sounds more bassy than it might measure. To me, the bass on the Odin is like pretty much how I hear music in real life. Moving up into the mids, the shelf there isn't as defined as it is on something like the The-Audio Monarch, but that also means that there is still some presence there in, the upper bass and then into the lower mids as well. But there is a little bit of contrast there in the mids that emphasizes the range right around like 1.5K. And this has the effect of having just a little bit of bloom going on. It's not on the level of being shouty, but at the same time, there's just a slight emphasis there to that 1.5K and above, 1.5 to 3K region. I worried that this was going to be like a little bit honky and a little bit, intense for some of the music that I listen to, but it actually lends itself really well to the kind of music that I like. And this is, again, a situation where I was trying to find music that didn't sound good on this. I was trying to find music that would make this sound honky, and I couldn't. The only thing that had a little bit of trouble there was electric guitars, but I think that's more to do with just the overall level of the upper mid-range, less the relationship between the upper mid-range and the lower mid-range, but it could also have something to do with that. But even then, it's not like it was on the wrong side of that. I found it to be totally fine. And then I found the same thing to be the case for vocals, where it affected it for sure, and it was a little bit forward there in the presentation, but not to a level where I was bothered by that. In spite of the fact that I generally prefer it to be a bit more relaxed in that region, I think the way that it's handled here is appropriate, and I think it works really, really well. And then moving up into the treble is a little bit relaxed on the Odin, I find. There's no sibilant issues, there's no percussion compression issues at like 5 and 6K. There's no roll off. This is well extended. Your cymbals crash through extremely well. It's a softer presentation, but it's not like that's part of the frequency response. It's not like it's withdrawn or rolled off like. If you guys remember, the Wraith was quite subdued in the treble, and this is nothing like that. So overall, I'd say this is a fairly neutral frequency response, or classically neutral, maybe with a little bit of a bass bump there in the sub bass, and then a smooth treble response, and it's fantastic. The frequency response here is almost perfect for the overall balance and everything, just with, again, a little bit of that slight forwardness for the upper mids. What does this mean? Well, it means you get a little bit more emphasis there for, depending on the instrument, you get a little bit more emphasis for fundamental over resonant harmonic, but it's not to the level of being compressed or congested or anything like that. It's just tonally rich, and then still resolving and well extended. So yeah, this gets really good marks for me for frequency response, and to me, that's the coolest thing. This is definitively the best tuned Empire Ears IEM that I've heard yet, and that's the exciting thing for me, because to me, Empire Ears is a company that's always been making IEMs that have a little bit more flair to them, to maybe appeal to a certain audience, a certain demographic. People who really love the V-shaped kind of sound, or they want that treble spice. That's not this IEM. The Odin sounds great without having to rely on any of these tricks or hooks to grab your attention. It simply just relies on the fact that it has fantastic technical performance. And then, the balance for the frequency response is very, very good as well. So needless to say, I think this sounds fantastic, but let's do some comparisons and see where it falls. The U12T up until now, like I mentioned, has been my favorite IEM. And for the mids and for the bass, I think the Odin is at least as good, if not better. The main difference between the U12T and the Odin, apart from frequency response, is that the U12T is only using balanced armature drivers, and yes, they are good ones. They are 64 audio TIA drivers for the treble frequencies, and it's a really punchy sounding IEM in spite of the fact that it's only using balanced armature drivers. But because the Odin has the dynamic drivers in the bass there, it gets a little bit better punch and slam, a little bit more impact to the bass frequencies. So it might not be as tight in the bass as the U12T, but it's got more of that fun slam quality. And I think for the level of bass that it has, I think it's totally appropriate. In short, what I'm saying is that while I love the U12T, I definitely prefer the Odin's bass. And then again, as far as the frequency response is concerned, the Odin is a little bit, more upper mid forward there, which I think is fine, even though I typically prefer the tonal balance of the U12T. So like, if I had to tell you my ideal tuning for an IEM, it would be the U12T so far, but then I also prefer the Odin for its technical abilities. So if someone were to come up to me and say, have either one of these, I don't know which one yet I would choose. I think it would probably depend a little bit on the genre that I was listening to. Compared to the Empire Ears Legend X, the Odin is a much more balanced tuned IEM. The Legend X is just bass for days, and the Odin, takes many of the good things about the Legend X, like its technical performance, and then just does it in a much more balanced and refined manner. And I love that quality. So for me, it's an easy choice. As much as I recommend the Legend X for bass heads, the bass shelf on the Legend X just extends way too far, in my opinion. And with the Odin, the level is a little more appropriate, and it also comes down a little bit more appropriately, early enough, and doesn't bleed into the mids. So yeah, the Odin for me is definitely the choice over the Legend X. Compared to the 64 Audio Tia Forte, this is an IEM that I think competes for technical performance. The main advantage with the Odin is that it's got a more agreeable frequency response than the Tia Forte. To me, the Tia Forte sounded like I was in a very specific room, for recording, where the Odin to me just sounds like something that I'd want to listen to all the time. And then lastly, compared to the T Audio Monarch, I'm still not sure how to say the name of the brand, The Audio. Somebody can correct me in the comments. The Monarch, the main thing about it is that it has a really nice bass shelf, like not too elevated. It's elevated more so than the Odin. There's more bass on the Monarch, but the thing with the Monarch is that it has a very specific and distinct bass shelf. So it comes down, maybe right at the upper bass around like 150 hertz. So it's a very, well-defined sub bass presentation on the Monarch that I think is fantastic. But the one drawback there is that it's not as filled in there in the lower mids. If this ridiculous price tag on the Odin isn't within your budget, then definitely check out the Audio Monarch, because the Monarch has a lot of good things going for it. Yeah, I mean, the Odin is definitely better than the Monarch, with a little better technical performance, a little better detail, and also a little bit better frequency response. But the Monarch, for its price, is a very competitive IEM that's worth checking out, and I'll be doing a review of that soon. But let's give a conclusion for the Odin. Do I recommend the Empire Ears Odin? Well, once again, I mean, this is a spare no expense IEM, and I think if I were to try and compare this to an over-ear flagship headphone, it would be something a little bit along the lines of the Focal Utopia. It has a similar kind of tonal balance to my ear, maybe a little bit more focused towards bass, because the Utopia rolls off a little bit. But at the same time, it has that same kind of refined quality to it, that is just really well balanced for everything. I know some people thought the Utopia didn't have the greatest timbre or was too analytic, but if you look at the frequency response, it's actually pretty well balanced. And to me, the Odin is kind of like that. I mean, there might be some music that you find that is a little too intense in the upper mids there for the Odin, but I wasn't able to find it. So if you do find it, let me know in the comments if you've had a chance to hear this. But so far for me, there's nothing that I've tried listening to on the Odin that hasn't sounded amazing. So yes, I absolutely, completely recommend the Empire Ears Odin. This is now up there with my favorite IEMs like the 64 Audio U12T. And I think this is something that people need to try. If you have a chance to try this, definitely do so. I think this is one of the very best IEMs. And to me, the most important thing about the Odin, apart from the fact that it's amazing sounding, is that this is the first Empire Ears IEM that's been tuned like this. This is the first one, at least from the ones that I've heard. And I would love it if Empire Ears tuned more IEMs like this. And I know it's not easy to do. It takes a lot of fine tuning to get it to be the right frequency response. And they did it with the Odin. I just want them to do it now more at IEMs that come in at lower price points, because this tuning is fantastic. This tuning is going to be more agreeable for more people than the stuff that is a little bit more flavor oriented that I've been used to with Empire Ears IEMs, like the Valkyrie and the Hero and the Zeus. That stuff might do really well for people who specifically want those tunings, but for anybody wanting a more balanced and let's just say generally agreeable tuning across the board for all genres, the Odin is that IEM, and I want them to do more of this. I want more of this at the various different price points. And if Empire Ears can do that, if this is any indication, if we can see a trickle-down effect for the frequency response they ended up with of the Odin, everybody wins. And so yes, the Odin, in my opinion, is an extremely successful effort by Empire Ears, and I can't wait to see what they do next, and I'm hopeful that it's something like the Odin, because this is awesome. Is it worth it? Is the value there? No, of course not. Once you're spending over $1,500, $2,000 on IEMs, the value isn't really the thing that you're, most concerned about. At least that's kind of how I see it. You're trying to get the thing that's the best, that's going to be your end game. And for a lot of people, I think the Odin is going to be exactly that. Anyways, that does it for this review. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.